Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's presentation on imposter syndrome, influences and individual development strategies. My name is Monica Vasquez, and my co-presenters today are Selena Ashton and Jesse Conchola. And just a quick disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of either Roche or the University of Arizona. So to begin, what is imposter syndrome? So here, if we can just take a few moments to reflect on, what do we think about when we hear the words imposter syndrome? And specifically, if you yourself have had feelings of imposter syndrome, what thoughts might you have had during this process? So imposter syndrome can be defined as an experience where one doubts their skills, abilities, accomplishments, or talents with feelings of fraudulently obtained success. So some thoughts that someone experiencing imposter syndrome might have might be, I feel like a fraud, I'm not good enough, I don't belong here, others know more than me, or I'll be found out soon enough. So imposter syndrome was first introduced in 1978, and it was described as an internal experience of intellectual phoniness that appears to be particularly prevalent and intense among a selected sample of high-achieving women. These women were university students and faculty. Now, despite their numerous academic and professional achievements, these women felt like imposters. So here we include a couple of quotes from that 1978 paper. The first quote, I was convinced that I would be discovered as a phony when I took my comprehensive doctoral examination. And the second quote, I'm not good enough to be faculty here. Now, these two quotes were meaningful to myself in that I had these exact same thoughts when I was nearing the end of my PhD program. And I think that this is meaningful in that I think a lot of times when we experience imposter syndrome, we think it is an internal experience that's unique to ourselves. When in fact, these women in 1978 had these feelings. I had these, same thoughts. I'm sure if I ask members of the audience, a lot of you would also say that you had these same exact thoughts. So it's meaningful in that I think we think it's internal, unique to us, but in fact, it's actually very common. So who does it affect? So even though imposter syndrome was first described amongst a group of very high achieving women, it's not just an experience of women. The prevalence of all individuals experiencing imposter syndrome, it's estimated to be around 70%, with the disclaimer that there are some sources that say that perhaps everyone has experienced imposter syndrome at some point in their academic and professional lives. Imposter syndrome is very commonly described among high-achieving individuals, and it has been shown to disproportionately affect disadvantaged and ethnic minority groups. And for the purposes of our audience today, I think it's very important to note that imposter syndrome is also very common among individuals in the statistical and data sciences. Here we include another couple of meaningful quotes. So the first quote, at some point, everybody practicing data science has experienced imposter syndrome. Again, I think this is meaningful because as data scientists, as biostatisticians, I think a lot of us have had these feelings of imposter syndrome. And again, I think we think it's unique to ourselves when in fact, again, the majority, if not all of our colleagues have experienced these feelings at some point. Okay, the next quote. Imposter syndrome is the elephant in the data science lab. Everyone has it. No one thinks other people have it, and no one talks about it. I think the key point here is that no one talks about it. So hopefully, by listening to this presentation today, like this provides some sort of avenue for us to talk about it. Okay, so what does it look like? So imposter syndrome can be experienced differently amongst all different types of individuals. These are just 3 examples of what it might look like. First, again, imposter syndrome, very commonly described among high achieving individuals who tend to set very high standards and goals for themselves. Now, there's nothing wrong with setting high standards and goals. I think the key here is just to think about somebody with imposter syndrome might have feelings of being overwhelmed at meeting, these numerous high standards and goals. It might also look like fear of failure. So if there is a task that needs to be completed, someone with imposter syndrome might have a lot of fear of failure or anxiety about underperforming at this task. It might also look like denial of competence and difficulty accepting recognition. So what this means is that even though someone successfully completes a task and there is that objective evidence of successful completion, and perhaps there is positive feedback, by an instructor or a manager, that somebody experiencing imposter syndrome might have difficulty accepting that recognition, and instead focus on arguments of why they were undeserving of that recognition, or maybe focus solely on how they could have done things better. So focus more on the negative and not so much the positive. So why is it a concern for the individual? So if you think about it, someone that has that fear of failure, that has that anxiety about underperforming, this might cause somebody to overly work or hyper-focus on a task more than what is necessary, thus risking potential burnout or a neglection of other priorities. There might also be this combination of somebody having that aggressive pursuit of achievement, but at the same time having difficulty accepting recognition. So this might cause an increase in stress levels and potentially a decrease in job satisfaction over time. Another concern is that it may affect academic, career trajectory, and advancement. And here we include a couple of examples. The first one being a personal example, so not applying to graduate school. So let me share with you this personal example. So as a junior, senior during my undergraduate career, about to attain my mathematics degree, I had a lot of feelings of imposter syndrome. I definitely compared myself to my fellow math students, felt like they knew more than me, felt a little bit like a fraud. And so thus I didn't even have a thought about applying to graduate school. Now, if it wasn't for my great undergraduate mentor, my undergraduate math advisor, he suggested that I look into applying to a graduate program in statistics, in which I did, and eventually obtained my master's and PhD and became a biostatistician. But this is just one example of how imposter syndrome could have had, a direct impact on my academic and career trajectory. Another example is a term called downshifters. This term is mainly used in academia, but it can be applied elsewhere. And for this, think about a student about to complete a PhD program. They're thinking about a career in academia. What downshifting means is that they might automatically, apply to a non-tenure track versus a tenure track position because they're having these feelings like they're a fraud, or they might not know as much as everybody else. So they might automatically opt to go for the non-tenure route versus the tenure route. Okay, so why should it be a concern to the organization? So here, this is just a reminder of that there are certain groups of individuals that are still underrepresented in our fields of study. So the figure on the left shows the percent of degree recipients at each level who are women. So along the columns, we see the degrees awarded for bachelor's, master's, and doctorate programs. And if we look at those first 2 columns, we see that women actually make up more than 50% of all degree recipients. But this isn't so when we're looking specifically at those math, computer science type related fields. So if we look at for example, that third column of research doctorates, we can see that women make up 25% of all degree recipients achieving a doctorate in mathematics, 23% for computer science. So there is still that underrepresentation of women in these fields of study. Similarly, if we look to the right, this shows the degrees earned by race ethnicity for the 2011 to 2017 years. So this is averaged over that period of time. And this is a percentage of degrees earned by US citizens or residents. So we can see here that American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander represents, close to 0% of the degrees awarded in stats and biostats. The next, smallest group are Black, African American, and Hispanics, making up about 5% or so each of these degrees. So this is just a reminder that there still is a large underrepresentation of certain groups in our fields of study. So why should it be a concern to the organization? So we know that there already is this underrepresentation, and as we will later hear, we do know that imposter syndrome does disproportionately affect certain groups of individuals, thus having a direct impact on diversity and organizational growth. So imposter syndrome could have direct impact on both the recruitment and retention of women, minorities, and other socioeconomic disadvantaged individuals in both the STEM pipeline and the workforce. Now, it should also be a concern for the organization because it can directly impact effective communication. So think about it. Individuals experiencing imposter syndrome, again, might not feel like they know as much as everybody else, might feel like a fraud. So for the student, that might mean not asking a question in class because they think everybody else knows the answer and they're the only one. Or in the workplace, again, you might have a colleague who thinks that others know more than them, and so might have that fear of speaking up, asking for help, or perhaps even second guessing their decisions or having an avoidance of feedback. So I think hopefully you can imagine here just how much of an impact imposter syndrome has. Again, it's very prevalent, and how you can think about how it might have direct impact in both the classroom and the professional setting.
Thank you, Monica. Next, let's look at the influences of imposter syndrome. These include academic, societal and institutional, and direct subject matter influences. First, academic. Inequality and opportunities begin early in life and tend to have a cumulative effect, leaving us feeling unprepared academically or different from the perceived majority. And this could make students feel at all levels more hesitant to ask for guidance. The motivations that differ from the perceived majority motivation can lead to inner conflict and feelings of loneliness and leave us in the margins of academia, at the outer edges. Societal and institutional influences are as follows. First, let's define societal and institutional. Societal includes a person's gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, location, religious or non-religious beliefs, orientation, be it sexual or not, and social hierarchy. Institutional includes corporate organizations, educational, and government institutions. Imposter syndrome exists and may be experienced differently for societal versus institutional. And so these insecurities may come from within the individual, which it also includes jealousy of others and can come from your group culture. These are societal, whereas the other insecurities can come from your work or academic environment, which are institutional. And then, of course, there are unspoken pressures that exist only in one's mind, which can be a composite of societal versus institutional influences. Now, groups who tend to experience negative stereotyping are more likely to experience imposter syndrome. And some examples include, I quote, "A good leader possesses predominantly masculine trait, and therefore women may be portrayed as not having that natural leadership quality, and so it prevents women from moving forward." Additionally, quote unquote, "Ethnic minorities are underachieving. Thus, admissions to programs or jobs are the result of luck or of affirmative action." Students who report discrimination are more likely to feel like imposters. For underrepresented groups, there may be additional pressures to achieve and break and therefore disprove these stereotypes. Some examples include, you may be the first in your family to attend your college, whereas we all in this group are the same in that regard. And you may be first in your field or first to open a new business. For underrepresented groups, there may be lack of representation and diverse role models or mentors. Now, in 2015, the NGC project indicated that less than 30% of world researchers were women. They broke it down and showed that 18% were in computer science, 20% in the physical sciences, and 43% in the mathematical sciences. In fact, the degrees awarded to minority women were only 12.6% Bachelor of Science, 7.8% in Master of Science, and 5% PhDs in science and engineering. And if you look at this table here that we have here, you could see the different breakdowns from 2011 to 2017, from Bachelor of Arts in Stats all the way to a PhD in Stats. And if I can guide you to 2017 as an example, there were 7 or 6.9% of women were awarded, minority women, I should say, were awarded PhD biostats, of which our very own Monica Vasquez, one of our presenters here, our first presenter, in fact, is one of those 7. Very good. Now, let's look at the subject matter, the influence on the data scientist and statistician. Data science and statistics and biostatistics, of which are subsumed one in the other, are certainly broad fields, and they cover many, many subject areas in computing languages. As data science evolves every single day, one cannot then be expected to be an expert in all these areas. If you were, then you'd be considered what we call a unicorn. So if you look here in this picture, in this graphic, in this Venn diagram, we see that your biostatistics, statistics, and math is interwoven with machine learning, programming, backend development, database, knowledge, business intelligence, business, domain or specific subject matter expertise. If you know all of these, then you're considered a unicorn, because not everybody knows all of these together. Only very few people do. That's why what we tend to do is we have subject matter expertise in each of these areas. We put together a team and we all work together to get the job done. Now, imposter syndrome is positively associated with technical skill, where most knowledgeable data scientists may have more self-doubt, which is actually an effect. And this is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which looks as follows. If you have little knowledge about a field, you are likely to overestimate your skills. So if you look at the graph to the right, we see that on the y-axis, we have personal confidence, and on the x-axis, actual competence. So as you go from left to right, at the very lower left, we ask, what is data science? Well, as we dig a little deeper, we see, oh, data science looks super easy, but now go a little bit deeper than that, and you see, well, actually, there's more than I thought. This is a bit complex. And then we go on and see that, okay, now the concepts are starting to make sense, until finally you are an expert and you know what you don't know. And you know that data science is complicated. There's so many facets that require knowledge, that you know what you don't know, but you know enough to go in to learn what you don't know as needed. Finally, with respect to imposter syndrome, we put forth the inverse of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which says if you have more knowledge about a field, you are likely to underestimate your skills. So keep that in mind as we continue our discussion on imposter syndrome.
My name is Selena Ashton, and I am a PhD student at the University of Arizona for the School of Information. I'm also getting my PhD minor in mathematics. Before I returned to grad school, I worked 20 years as a professional family historian and social history researcher. So I will be sharing my next few ideas with you from the perspective of a mentor and a mentee with experience, without experience in two very different fields. When we think of imposter syndrome, we often wonder if we have what it takes to do a certain something. Do I have what it takes to be a nurse, for example? If I were to Google nursing staff, do I see myself represented here? Is there something here that can encourage me to grow? Or is there something here that would make me feel like I'm not enough? Likewise, what if I want to be a top CEO and I Google it? Well, first of all, we're not going to talk a lot about machine learning algorithms, but we will talk about when we see other people and we see other ideas, how do we internalize that? And would something like this that shows up on a Google image search, would that encourage me, or would that make me feel pretty upset or sad or discouraged? Likewise, if I wanted to be a graduate student and go into mathematics, will that help my feelings of imposter syndrome, or will it create more? When I Google graduate students in mathematics, this is what I find. By the way, I tried to do statistics in graduate studies, but I kept getting bar graphs. And so what if I wanted to do something completely different? What if I were an elderly woman approaching 80, retired bank teller who wanted to fight depression and caring for my aging mother, and I wanted to do something different? And I chose computer programming. What would people tell me? Would they encourage me, or would they discourage me? And so those are questions that a lot of people face. And so we have Masaku Wakamiya, who experienced a few of those things, but she set out to learn coding anyway. And at 82, she is one of the oldest programmers and did not let imposter syndrome, sexism, ageism, quarantine during our COVID times, she did not let any of that stop her. And so she is also not an outlier. 1 out of 45 programmers who use Code Academy are 55 years or older. So when we think about how people do these different things, how did they get to that point of strength? What did they do? What strategies did they employ to deflate any feelings of imposter syndrome? First, it's important to know that imposter syndrome is common. You are not the only one who has it. I have it, we all have it. But we also have our own set of strengths and weaknesses. We are all expert in our own field, and we're all learning and growing together. Masking is a concept where you see people say, this is so easy, the class is so slow, I've been doing this forever, why is this hard for you? Masking is not the same as imposter syndrome, but when we look at other people masking, we tend to think that they're telling the truth, and then we judge ourselves harshly in the process. So the best thing you can do at that moment and in other moments is to recognize imposter syndrome, and then you can deal with it. Don't compare yourself to what you think you see in others or what you think you hear other people saying. This is not just for grad school. This is for in the field, when you're new to a job, when you're given a position of authority, when you're changing careers. Talk to your colleagues, talk to your mentors, talk to your cohorts, your advisors, managers, and other mentors. Ask your questions. It's okay to ask questions. And if you are asked a question, it's okay to say, I don't know. That's a great question. Let me get back to you on that. And then if you do feel like you're going into a hostile situation, a toxic environment, please do look at your policy handbook to see what can be done about that. Dr. Benjamin Hardy has written a book called The Gain in the Gap. The idea behind this and how it fits into imposter syndrome is that you're going to compare yourself to where you were in order to grow. So what a lot of us will do is we'll be in a position and we'll say, oh, I really want to be here. I want to do all these great things, and I'll never get there. I'm never good enough. I'm not smart enough. Don't do that. Instead, look at where you are. Where were you 3 months, 6 months, 1 year ago? What did you learn? How are you different from now compared to when you started grad school? How are you different now than when you started your entry-level position at your current company? That's the growth that is going to take you forward and propel you away from imposter syndrome and towards growth. If you are a mentor, one thing you can do is, again, make sure that there isn't hazing or harassment going on in your environment. Make an effort to help students and employees overcome any negative self-talk. That is probably not something you're going to hear, and it's probably not something that people will admit to, but no, it does happen. And so check in with them, ask them, how are you feeling about this? Or what are you thinking about your position, your situation, or your growth? Lead with compassion and empathy, and remember you were also once a beginner. Keep that growth mindset and do your check-ins with your students or your mentees or your employees. Effective mentors are keen therapists who walk students and employees through this growth from imposter syndrome to a place of empowerment and confidence. It's often helpful when you share situations that have helped you through imposter syndrome. When I worked with people in family history and social history research, I often found people who were expert in their research. They knew their place, they knew their local jurisdictions, they knew everything about that family that they were researching. No one could have been more expert than they have been because they'd spend sometimes decades on this family branch. They would come in with imposter syndrome and they would think that I knew more about them just because I had the credentials. And it was my job to talk them up, build them up and say, you're the expert. That is growth that they needed to go forward in solving all of their problems. Likewise, I have a PhD advisor who does the same thing for me. He sees where I am and he encourages that growth. Other recommended strategies for leaders is you want to encourage that growth by creating a culture that reinforces feelings of inclusiveness and fit within the organization. One thing that has helped me tremendously is that when I present on Zoom or I have meetings on Zoom, people make sure that I can understand because I wear hearing aids. And they are inclusive, they are kind, they're professional. That inclusivity makes me feel validated. Maintain clear standards of equity, equality, and inclusivity. Challenge any societal norms and negative stereotypes, and create that environment that encourages questions. It could be academic questions, it can be policy questions, it could be a simple question like, I didn't hear you, can you please repeat that? Give constructive feedback. That encourages growth. It is that growth that encourages people away from imposter syndrome towards a better version of themselves.
In conclusion, imposter syndrome is very common, particularly so among high-achieving individuals. It has been shown to disproportionately affect individuals from underrepresented or disadvantaged backgrounds, and it can have direct impact on personal career development, work relationships, and organizational growth and diversity. Now, the key takeaway messages for individuals, so the students, the employees, is that hopefully by this presentation, you would have understood just how common imposter syndrome is. And that when you're experiencing imposter syndrome, hopefully you recognize it and that you feel more open to talk about it. And also just a reminder to be kind to yourself while you're having these feelings and to seek support if needed. And to the leaders, we hope just to convey the message that we hope that you're cognizant of creating these environments that encourages open communication and mentorship. So to conclude this presentation, so just as we began, if we can just take a moment to reflect on thoughts that we might have. So when we start having those negative thoughts of imposter syndrome, like what might we think about instead to help overcome these feelings? So what are some positive thoughts you might have to counteract the negative? So some things we might tell ourselves instead of having those negative thoughts are that, I am capable. I am more than good enough. I do belong here. I bring my unique strengths and experiences, and I do contribute effectively. And to close, just a reminder to please seek out help if you need it.